We don't get very far into this part of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain before we start to tune him out. Love your enemies. Love your enemies. You can't really mean that, right, Jesus? And what does that really mean for us in today's world? I mean, after all, we don't really have enemies in the fairy tale sense. It's not like we're Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride. Have you seen that movie? And you know, we don't really run around saying, as he did, "My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." Most of us haven't made that kind of enemy revenge our life's mission. We think we don't have enemies, or maybe we just don't want to take Jesus seriously because it's hard. And while we may not have a sworn enemy like Inigo Montoya, we do have people who annoy us, people we passionately disagree with or who disagree with us, drivers on the road who don't do things the way that we want them to, who cut us off or don't use their blinker or do use their blinker or forget to use their turn signal, people different from us with whom we just kind of don't see them or we ignore them. We think of them as less than. And in most of our families, there are sometimes people who are kind of the black sheep. Maybe not our enemies, but that weird uncle or that brother who's made a mess of his life. In Disney's new movie Encanto, which I do highly recommend if you haven't seen it, it's wonderful. It's all about family and family life, and there's a brother, Bruno, who really is the black sheep. He was kind of always getting into trouble, messing with his brothers and sisters, making them mad, but he left the family because of the difficulties that he brought to them. Now the family just thinks that he has abandoned them and that this is just one of those things bad Bruno did. There's even a whole song in the movie, "We Don't Talk About Bruno." And sometimes in our families, we have those people we don't talk about too. And how often do we find ourselves blaming other people, like the black sheep in our family, for things that have gone wrong in our own lives or the problems that we face? Even something simple, like I think about my battle every morning of the school week with Lydia, who is 5. I have to get her out of the house on time, and it's a struggle. Now, I find myself sometimes wondering, why can't Lydia just get dressed faster? But she's 5, and I'm the adult, right? So no matter how slow she goes, I'm the one responsible to figure out the situation. It doesn't help make anything better when I'm just upset with her. So in those minor inconveniences and annoyances and the family relationships gone awry, we don't always want to love. If Jesus said, love the people who annoy you, who frustrate you, who annoy the living daylights out of you, who wants to do that? I'd rather be annoyed and stuck in my own frustration. It's hard to love. Yesterday at Messy Church, we were talking about God and God's love, and I asked the kids, is it ever hard to love people sometimes? And while the kids just stared at me, all the adults gave me knowing nods. One even did something like this. Yes, it is hard to love people. Oop, I just made myself dizzy. It's hard to love people, right? So loving our enemies is hard to do. We don't want to do it. We forget about it. We don't take Jesus seriously. And yet, he's still here telling us, love your enemies. Do good for them. Pray for them even. Now, how do we do that? And why should we do that? Is Jesus just a little cuckoo here? Is he just pie in the sky, dreaming about things? Well, I think he gives this advice, one, because he's showing the way to a better world, and two, he's showing us the way to have better lives. After college, I worked at a campus ministry in California. It was funny because I was like 22 and having to deal with a bunch of kids who were, like a year younger than me. This campus ministry had 6 townhouses, and there were about 40 students that lived there. Now, I was the community coordinator and kind of in charge of their life, and thus many maintenance problems and conflict issues and all kinds of other not fun stuff came to me. And like I said, I was 22 and really didn't know what I was doing. Now, there was a resident who constantly had problems and constantly came to me wanting me to fix his problems. And it was hard, and I was constantly annoyed with him. Now, my boss, who was the minister there of this campus ministry, she gave me the same advice Jesus gave. She said, "Why don't you pray for him and see what happens?" Now, I can't say that my outlook on him and his complaints radically changed, but I can say that my little begrudging prayers, they did make a difference. And now that I'm years away from that experience, I can say that my experience praying for him did change my outlook. And I remember him as kind of this funny kid who had a lot of opinions, but who also had good sides to him and things that I could learn from him. Somehow, loving our enemies and praying for them does transform us. God works in us slowly over time. God helps us to love our enemies, and we do it. We love our enemies, or we try to, because Jesus said so, of course, but also because our own transformation leads us to more love and more freedom in our lives. We grow spiritually through the practice of loving our enemies, and it helps us to find more fulfillment in our lives. Also yesterday at Messy Church, one of the activities we did was a science experiment with daisies. I don't know how well anybody can see this, but we put a little tube of water with food coloring in the bottom and stuck the daisy in it, and like magic, although it's just science, the flower sucks up the water, which sucks up the food coloring, and you can kind of see maybe on this one that this daisy has started to get some blue on the edges. Now, I think that's kind of how God works in us, slowly over time. With more love, we become more loving, and when we become more loving, we know more love in our lives. Now, one caveat I have to say is that Jesus is not saying that we should ignore real harm from people. We should not allow abuse to continue, especially in our relationships, in our homes. We know that God's love puts care above all else. Sometimes love involves saying no and stopping abuse or putting up a boundary, and sometimes that can be the hardest but most loving thing that we can do in a relationship. So when we hear Jesus saying, "Love your enemies," and you hear me saying, "Love your enemies," know that I'm not saying that you should endure violence or real abuse. Never. Instead, Jesus is teaching us about the transformation of the world into a more loving place. It's about love and freedom. We don't want to be like Inigo Montoya, do we? Set just on eradicating our enemies. We don't want to blame everyone for our problems. We don't want to be constantly annoyed with our coworker or our family member. It's really no way to live. So if we lived into a world where we loved our enemies and prayed for them, people would see us and know that we are behaving like God's children, as Jesus said in the passage. It would change lives, ours and the people around us. Reverend Jess Cast, who's a pastor in Pennsylvania, posted on Instagram about this passage. And she said, "It hit me today, praying for my enemies might mean that my enemies are praying for me too. And if that is the case, my enemy now becomes the one who blesses me." Reverend Cast is a lesbian and a pastor and faces so much opposition and hate because of those two things. She probably does have people who consider themselves really to be her enemy, and yet she finds strength and blessing in even those prayers that people say probably against her, because she believes so strongly that God uses every prayer for love. It's like at the end of the Joseph story, what God intended for harm, or what you intended for harm, God has used for good. And so what Jess is talking about and showing us is the kind of freedom that we can live into. It's the kind of freedom and love that Jesus is leading us into. God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God. So this week, let's add more love to the world by loving our enemies, praying for those who annoy us, those who anger us. Now, when I prayed, when I worked at that campus ministry, it was hard to do, and it was not ever a beautiful prayer. Even now, when I find myself getting mad or annoyed, I can usually just mutter something like, "God, I pray for so-and-so." It doesn't have to be an elaborate prayer to pray for our enemies, but even that little tiny prayer will change your heart just a little bit. More love and more prayer is the way to more life and more freedom for all of us. So let's try it.